Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work. Welcome back for another night, wildlings. There's a saying popular among homebrew philosophers about cats and curiosity, but cats at least have the sense to not go seeking their own demise, most of the time. Some humans, well, you'll see. This is the Harbinger experiment, written by Zion J. The world that we live in is full of things that we don't understand. Humans being curious creatures, we naturally try and seek out those things. Doing so has led us to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we never could have imagined 100 years ago. We've defeated disease, built to the sky itself, and even created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and into the stars. If our ancestors could see us in what we've created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and our lust for knowledge has not always led to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have also been uncovered in humanity's quest for knowledge. In the end, I fear this evil may be our doom. I don't say this from the standpoint of a philosopher who's sat and simply pondered these things either. No, I say this because I've seen it, I've experienced it. I was a part of it. The story that I'm about to relay to you is true in its entirety. This I swear. I feel certain that this will fall on deaf ears, and many of you will believe this to simply be another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills, but I promise you that this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of this story is simply to warn you of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I myself don't understand it. What I am about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain that it'll happen again. In 1971, a not-so-well-known scientist began his preparations for an extremely secretive project known simply as the Harbinger experiment. I'd like to keep the identity of this scientist a secret for personal reasons, so throughout this recounting, I'll refer to him simply as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is cloudy at best before 1971. All that's known about him before that time is that he had grown up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination for the occult and supernatural. This made him something of an outcast in the scientific community due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was at the time, and still is. Zimmerman's opinions concerning the otherworldly were not the sole cause of him being an outcast, though it was the methods that he used that made him so wildly unacceptable among his peers. Zimmerman was well known during his time for being ruthless beyond measure and cold. He never cared about the means that he used. All that mattered to him was the results, and if he predicted those results to be valuable enough, anything would be worth obtaining them. It was that insatiable and brutal lust for the truth that made him feared among those that knew of him. And the few that knew of him and didn't fear him believed that he should be followed and his work closely watched. The word Harbinger itself has such a mysterious, intimidating taste to it. Maybe it's the way it rolls off our tongues, or maybe it's simply due to its association with the project for myself, but the word always seems to carry a certain amount of doom with it, which would make sense. The word itself means to warn or forebode. I can't imagine Zimmerman's reason for giving this experiment that title, but in retrospect, it fits perfectly. Zimmerman came to town to select a few people, me being one of them. He told us that he was working on something big and that he needed people who could keep confidentiality and not spread idle gossip of his work. While he didn't fully trust some of us, he did know that we were professionals and, for one reason or another, we were all in dire need of employment. I had worked at the local clinic as a doctor, but was caught stealing medication and promptly fired. This left a very dark mark on my resume, so work was hard to find. I was also native to Alaska and lived near where the experiment would take place, so I guess you could say I was a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity. It was hard not to when I saw the payout. 15 of us were hired in total. Some were colleagues of his that had been working with him for a while, some were maintenance workers, and a few were hired as private security. I was the only medical professional to be hired. It's still a wonder to me how he even attained the funds necessary for the experiment. I wouldn't be wholly surprised if his financing wasn't entirely legal. But legal or not, I needed the money and he was paying. In hindsight, that's a decision I've come to regret. After Zimmerman got his funding, he used it to buy a relatively large plot of land deep in the Alaskan wilderness. On that piece of land, Zimmerman built a concrete structure, not dissimilar to a bunker, in fact. The sole difference being that its design was to keep any potential damage contained within the structure rather than keeping it out, as he put it. Most of the structure was built underground, which had the effect of making the complex seem much smaller than it really was from the outside, as would be expected. There was only one way of entering and leaving the structure, and that was via a ladder that led from the small, unassuming concrete building on the surface, which I will refer to from now on as the entrance building for convenience, to the network below. After everyone had gone to bed at night, the hatch that contained the ladder would be sealed off with a very large, thick metal lid. Zimmerman was adamant about this. Located not too far away from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that would serve as the sleeping quarters for the staff Zimmerman had hired. Compared to the entrance building standing on the surface, the underground system was massive. At the center of the complex was the control room. This is where all the facility's electronics and such were linked to and controlled. This included the security cameras, the lights, and the doors. Consoles, monitors, and computers lined the walls of this large central chamber. This is also where the ladder in the entrance building connected to in the underground complex. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One led to a smaller room that served as the infirmary, another door led to a break room, and the last door led to the hallways. The hallways are where the complex began to feel extremely eerie. They were, for some reason, laid out in an extremely confusing scheme that led in circles and to complete dead ends. These hallways made up a vast majority of the underground area, and it would be very easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with it. But if you knew where you were going, before long you would find yourself standing before one of 3 8-by-8-foot rooms. Each room had a camera hooked up in one of its corners, and all 3 of those were connected to a corresponding monitor in the control room. Cameras were also scattered throughout the hallways so that whoever was watching their corresponding monitor could see anywhere they wanted to, when they wanted to. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance to each of the 3 rooms, and in order to open them you would have to enter a 4-digit code in a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived there and how badly the hallways frightened me. I've always been claustrophobic, and those corridors were so very narrow. The noise, or more accurately, the lack of noise, was also a tremendous source of fear for me in those bleak, narrow spaces. It was always so unnaturally silent, as if everything in the entire world had stopped moving. It really made you feel like you were trapped down there. Thankfully, though, I only rarely ventured into the hallways, for I was the only medical professional in the facility and I had virtually no reason to leave the infirmary. In the beginning, I found it quite peculiar that Zimmerman would ask for a medic like myself on a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. You see, the official purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind. This is what was listed on the reports being sent out, at least. But unbeknownst to all those who were not participating in the experiment, excluding the subjects, of course, the true purpose was much darker. Like I said before, Zimmerman had always had an obsession with the occult and the supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who didn't believe in him. Simply stated, he wanted physical proof that the supernatural was a real phenomenon, and he wanted to be the first one to attain said proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to find the proof of the metaphysical, a world we couldn't see. The thought of doing this was naturally a tad bit daunting and even scary, but it was Zimmerman's method of doing so that was truly terrifying. He believed that he would be able to open a portal between worlds momentarily, allowing 3 random entities to cross over into our world, and each one of these beings would then be trapped within one of the 3 rooms. Zim had the theory that any entity would try and latch on to the nearest living thing that had the capacity to contain it. He wanted to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that had been injected with a compound mixture of his own creation. In theory, this compound would keep the entity from simply leaving whatever it was attached to. The only way it would be able to leave a host who had been injected with the compound was through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would have to be something living, with a will strong enough to survive the possession. And there's only one known species of animal that possesses the amount of will required for this: humans. Zimmerman had also done something, I'm not sure, to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms and that there would only be one entity in each room, though I can't say I know exactly what it was he did. In fact, I know next to nothing when it comes to how he did any of this. He liked to keep his methodology a secret, even from his most trusted colleagues, most likely due to his paranoia that someone would steal his ideas and then take credit for the success of said ideas. If I had known that this was how it was going to go before I signed up, I might have reconsidered, but Zimmerman decided not to tell us until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been allowed to do so. The security team he'd hired was loyal to him and to the payout. It's not likely that Zimmerman had given them the order to allow anyone to leave. There were, of course, 3 subjects included in the experiment. All were native to Alaska, and each one was lured into the project under the belief that they would be participating in a harmless psychological study. Effect of isolation on the human mind, as I had mentioned before. This is why none of the subjects objected when they realized they'd be confined to one of those 3 rooms I'd mentioned. The first subject was a young man, apparently out of work and desperately needing the money that had been offered for participating in the study. The second was a woman. By looking at her, I could tell that she was an addict of some sort. The third and final subject was an older man, a drifter if I had to guess. One of the things that they all had in common was that none of them had any family or friends left. In short, no one would miss them. This is why they were chosen for the project. I wish I could supply more information about the subjects, but all this has been drawn from my memory, and I was given little information on the 3 to begin with. The experiment didn't officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to begin, so I packed up and headed out to the site as soon as I could. I arrived a week before the subjects had even signed up, and a month before the project began. I wasn't the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman, his colleagues, and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say that I was the first among those outside his circle of trust to arrive. Everyone had arrived about a week before the experiment began. There was a noticeable rift between those of us who were simply there for the money, like myself, and those who were Zimmerman's followers. On October 15th, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed into their rooms, the cameras, lights, and speakers were fully operational, and the staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to begin. Zimmerman had asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 p.m. to witness the beginning of the experiment. He wanted everyone to be present when he proved that all of his theories had been correct, and that he wasn't just a madman. He wanted all of us to see the fruits of his labor. When everyone had finally gathered in the large control room, Zimmerman turned to us and simply said, "Observe." Then he turned his back to us, leaned into the microphone that would project his voice through the 3 rooms, and began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain no one but he could understand. We all watched the 3 large monitors on the wall, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects all stood in their rooms, dumbstruck by Zim's chanting, staring at their cameras with confused expressions on their faces. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I can't explain exactly what it was, but a horrible feeling of dread washed over me. Dread and fear. It was then that the ground actually began to shake subtly and the lights began to flicker. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing was off or wrong, while the subjects began flailing around their rooms, screaming for help. Then suddenly the ground stopped shaking and the images on the monitors turned to static. The air became very heavy as we all stared at the screens, waiting for them to regain their images, show us what was happening in those 3 rooms. For a while, all was silent. But then someone began screaming. The screams of a woman going through unbearable pain and terror began to echo through the compound. The familiar screams of men began to coincide with the woman's terrified screams, and together they mixed into an awful symphony of pain and fear that beat mercilessly into our ears. The outsiders among us began to give each other frightened looks while Zimmerman's loyalists seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never come back to this awful place, but we all knew deep down that Zim would never allow that to happen. We were here for the long haul, like it or not. It was 10:30 p.m. when the screaming finally stopped, and the monitors had yet to reveal to us what had occurred in those 3 rooms. After the screaming ended, Zimmerman stood and dismissed us for the night, adding that we were forbidden to come back into the compound until 10 a.m. the following morning. Not like any of us wanted to. We all solemnly made our way out of the compound and towards the cabins, settling in for the night. I feel it's safe to say that not all of us slept well or easily that night. The following morning, when the staff gathered at the entrance building, we all stood exchanging tired or nervous looks, waiting for Zimmerman to arrive and open the hatch that concealed the ladder. I could see palpable fear in the eyes of some of us, while others didn't seem to have been even remotely affected by what had happened. Zim showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologizing for his tardiness as he came through the door of the entrance building. He opened the hatch and without any hesitation began descending the ladder into the black abyss. He almost seemed enthusiastic. I was the first to follow his dark descent into the facility. It seemed that the further I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. And as I climbed deeper, I couldn't help but feel that the place was somehow different. While before there'd only been unsettling concrete hallways and rooms, now there was something else. Something that made the eeriness feel real and personified. I felt like a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us down there, but I continued despite my fear and hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was darkness and malevolence in the air. A true evil now lived here, and I could feel it. We all could. Finally, I reached the end of the ladder and let out a silent sigh of relief to be on solid ground. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs came alive, dousing the room in their warm and welcome light. Zim must have turned on the power, I thought, allowing myself to take a couple of seconds to examine the control room. It was exactly as we had left it the previous night, for which I gave a silent and thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I shook myself from my thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. I let my eyes slowly make their way towards the monitors on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes that would be on them. My attention was first grabbed by monitors 1 and 3, which were still pure static. It would have been a small relief, but then the motionless image on monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still and everything seemed entirely untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing in that was different. The woman lay in the center of the small concrete room. An expression of fear and terror was on her frozen, gaunt face as she lay silent and lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He ordered that the second monitor be turned off, and so it was. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images in monitors 1 and 3 did not return within the next 2 hours, the security team would be sent to investigate the rooms. The guards nodded at hearing this. They made it seem as if they had no fear, but we could see it in their eyes. The subtly loud tick-tock of the clock was the only sound that echoed through the control room while I stared at the monitors. An hour and 50 minutes had gone by, and static was still all that occupied Monitor 1 and Monitor 3. Everyone was working except me, this due to the fact that the project had been completely injury-free thus far, so I essentially had nothing to do but wait for someone to hurt themselves. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues, and I were the only ones that occupied the control room. They quietly chatted amongst each other on the other side of the room while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I currently found myself in. I'd clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence enough of that, and God only knew what awaited us in the other rooms. My thoughts were soon interrupted as Monitor 3's image returned. The clear image now displayed on the screen made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was displayed on the monitor was horrifying. A humanoid thing stood in the center of the room, staring directly at the camera, unmoving. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had been issued, but this was clearly not the same man that had entered the room. What caught my attention first were its eyes. They were solid black and twice the size of normal human eyes. They seemed so endless and cold. Its head had also grown with the eyes in a symmetrical and unsettling manner. The being had also shed all the hair on its head, and even from the monitor I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. Also, it had seemingly grown in height and stature, which could be seen from the fact that the jumpsuit was now obviously far too small for its wearer. Its limbs had grown especially long, and its arms hung almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way the same man we had sent inside. Fear was all I felt as I continued to stare at the thing in the room, and my fear seemed to be shared by those around me, which made me feel kind of good. That may sound awful, but it was a bit satisfying to see that Zimmerman and his colleagues could fear that same emotion too. But at the same time, it was worrying because this showed that this wasn't part of the plan. Something had gone wrong. We all stared into the monitor at the thing despite our terror. It was almost as if we were in a trance. My already present fear began to grow and spread rapidly through my body as I became lost in the creature's eyes, trapped in that hypnotic gaze. After what felt like forever, I managed to break eye contact with the thing and divert my attention from the monitor. When I did so, I felt considerably better. After a short while, Zimmerman ordered his security team to make their way to Subject 1's room just as he said he'd do. The team left without question, armed with batons and pistols. I focused my attention on watching the men progress through the hallways towards Subject 1's room. Even through the not-so-high-quality cameras, it wasn't hard to tell that these men were afraid of what awaited them. Their heads were downcast as they walked. They didn't possess the same confidence within them that they had when this project had begun. They looked like scared boys being sent off to a terrible war. Eventually, they made it to the door. We had a perfect view of them and the door via the camera opposite. One of them said something through one of their walkie-talkies and motioned towards the camera. In response, one of Zimmerman's colleagues buzzing the door open. The men already had their pistols out by the time the button was pushed. Slowly, the door opened. We all watched eagerly as the man began to approach the door, guns aimed inside. Suddenly, without warning, there was a loud shriek, and as something bounded out of the room and at the men, the monitor turned to static. Immediately, we could hear screaming echoing down the hallways, followed shortly after by the distinct sound of gunshots. We couldn't do anything but wait. After a couple of minutes, the screaming and the shots stopped. We all waited and prayed, hoping that whatever bounded at them from the room would not be the one to return to the control room. After a couple more minutes, 3 of the men came back carrying the corpse of the 4th. He had massive cuts covering his chest, his face was shredded, you couldn't even tell who he was anymore. I was used to gore being a doctor, so I felt somewhat unfazed by the mass of shredded flesh and bloodied meat that they carried with them, but many of the others went pale, some vomited. The guards' expressions were emotionless masks, eyes filled with terror. One of the men finally looked up at us, stared at us for a while with those wide eyes of his. "It's dead," he finally managed to mutter with a shaken and scared voice. 2 hours went by. The dead man's name was Frank. He was buried outside in the cold Alaskan ground. 2 of the men were unharmed, physically, at least. The 3rd was alive, but only barely. His body was covered in bloody slashes and one of his eyes had been gouged out. I managed to stabilize him, but only just. The other 2 men then vaguely explained what happened. Apparently, Subject 1 had leaped out at Frank after the door had opened, only it wasn't really Subject 1 anymore. According to them, it had hideously contorted features and long, sharp claws. They claimed to have shot it over a dozen times before it fell dead, then emptied another dozen bullets into it just to be sure it really was. Only once it was dead had they come back. After tending to the wounded man, I went to investigate the monitors. As afraid as I was of seeing what those monitors may have held, I needed to see. Subject 3 was the only one left now, and I needed to know. I had to make sure the creature was still in its room. It seemed more like a jail cell than an ordinary room at this point, though, which was probably a good thing. The cameras displaying Subject 1's room in the hallway outside it still displayed a static-filled screen. No one was sent to repair them or to investigate. We just had to hope that Subject 1 was well and truly dead. Monitor 3's image was exactly the same as it had been when I'd left. Subject 3 was still staring directly into the camera. At us. It was still in the exact same position, and if it weren't for the small fan in the corner of the room, I'd think I was looking at a still image. In a way, I felt relief at seeing this. Relief that he was still in his room and that he hadn't escaped while no one was looking. After everything quieted down, I noticed something especially unusual. There was a strange sound emanating from somewhere. At first, it was barely noticeable. The only reason I'd heard it was because of how extremely quiet it was in the infirmary. But as time went by, it slowly began to increase in volume. After about an hour, it was loud enough that everyone else could hear it too. And after a couple more hours, its volume had increased so much that we could determine what the noise was. It was a song. One of the staff members identified it as "Living in the Sunlight" by Tiny Tim. Apparently his father had loved the song and listened to it frequently. It seemed to be on a loop and kept replaying itself. Although we were able to identify it, we remained unable to identify the source. We knew that it wasn't coming from the speakers because we had turned them off. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. More time ticked by as we all became increasingly agitated by the song. I spent most of my time in the infirmary, attending to Frank or in the control room. Fear hung in the air, and the presence of unmistakable darkness and evil was no doubt its source. Subject 3 still hadn't moved. He kept his unblinking gaze fixed on the camera the entire time. It always felt like he was staring directly at me, no matter where I was in the room. I think the others were also feeling this effect, because they seemed to move around the room a lot for seemingly no reason. After a few hours, the song was so loud that people almost had to shout in order to communicate. We'd been trying to find its source so we could turn it off, but to no avail. It was completely unidentifiable. This added a level of extreme irritation to our already very present fear. It was around 8:30 a.m. that the ground itself began to shake once again, just as it had done the previous night. Panic began to spread among my fellow employees as shaking grew in intensity. During this time, I had the sudden instinctual feeling to look over at Subject 3's monitor. It was gone. Almost as if on cue, the power went out, and thankfully, so did the song. Ever since the security team had returned, panic had been slowly building up among the staff, and Zimmerman was powerless to stop it. When those lights went out, the calm projections that everyone had been trying to maintain left us, and the fear in all our hearts took over. The emergency backup lights kicked on shortly after the power went out, for which I was thankful. The lights were dim, but they allowed me to see. Total panic seized us as many of my fellow staff members began screaming and rushing to the ladder in an attempt to escape, but too many were trying to use it at once, and no one was able to get very far without someone else pulling them down and taking their place. Zimmerman was shouting for everyone to calm down, but his dominating and intimidating personality had no effect here, and his demands fell upon deaf ears. It was total chaos. It wasn't long until people actually started hurting each other in their desperate attempts to get up that ladder. I could only stand against the wall and wait for my opportunity to escape. All of the screams were soon silenced as the familiar hum of that unsettling song began to rise in volume again, only much quicker this time. And this time, it was clear that the noise was coming directly from the maze-like corridors. People stopped fighting and shouting as all our attention shifted to the door that led to the hallways. The song quickly got louder than it ever had before, which forced many of us to cover our ears with our hands in an attempt to silence the din. Then suddenly the song just completely stopped. Silence. That was all that filled the room as we stared at the thick metal door in anticipation of what was coming. It felt like ages had gone by, but in reality it was probably only seconds before the silence was broken. Then the door shuddered and burst open, and the music started again, louder than it had ever been before. The suddenness and volume of this caused many of us to recoil, falling to the ground and grabbing our ears in an attempt to block out the roar. I glanced up for just a second, and in the doorway stood a tall, smooth-skinned figure with long limbs and eyes so dark and malevolent that you could clearly see them in the dim lighting. After I got my bearings, I looked upwards at the creature once again just in time to see the thing pick up and rip Zimmerman in half in one fluid movement, dousing the room and everyone in it with his blood. I was no stranger to gore, but the sight of that was too much for me to bear. I hunched over immediately after seeing this and vomited all over the cement floor. That ladder is my only hope of survival, I thought to myself as I forced myself into a standing position. As I rose, I could see the thing ripping and tearing through people as they scattered in an attempt to escape it. It was distracted, and as awful as this sounds, it was my only chance to get up the ladder. I forced my legs to move, trying to block out the terrified screams of my fellow staff members and the unbearably loud music. I could hear gunshots coinciding with the screams and terrible sounds of flesh being ripped apart somewhere in that mess of noise. I reached my hands outward and felt a wave of relief wash over me as my fingers came into contact with the hard metal rungs of the ladder. I gripped them and began to climb upwards just as fast as I could in my disoriented state, all the while praying that the monster would not see me and pull me off this ladder and back into the slaughter. I felt like at any moment I'd feel one of its smooth hands wrap around my ankles, pulling me to my death, but I eventually made it to the top. There was no question in my mind. I had to close that hatch and seal that thing down there, even if it meant certain death for my colleagues. I couldn't allow that thing to escape. I gripped the thick metal lid and began to push with all my might in an attempt to seal the underground complex off. Despite how sturdy it was, the lid was surprisingly easy to move, and it didn't take very much effort to push it over the hatch, even in my weakened state. In seconds, the hatch was completely covered by the dense metal lid. I collapsed on my side and began to vomit some more as exhaustion overtook me. And as I lay there, I realized something aside from my labored breaths. The only thing that I could hear from below was the faint echo of that song. I felt as though I'd lose more of my sanity if I continued to lay there and listen to it, so I once again forced myself to my feet and began to make my way to the wooden lodge that I'd stayed in the previous night. It was where I'd left my baggage and also where I left the keys to my truck. Of the 15 staff members that took part in that forsaken experiment, I'm the only one who survived. I've never returned to that awful place where all of this happened, and I don't intend to. The project was very secretive, and Zimmerman was the only one who knew all of its details. As far as I know, no one is aware of my involvement aside from me. In fact, I'm probably the only one alive who knows what the Harbinger experiment truly was, let alone what actually happened. By now, you're probably wondering why I've told you all about something none of you should be aware of. Maybe you're expecting me to give you a speech about not messing with things you don't understand, or something along those lines. I hope not, for I have no speech to give or lesson to impart. I began hearing a noise earlier today. Almost immediately, I recognized it as a very haunting and familiar song. I didn't even try to trace its source. I knew it would be pointless. And as the days progressed, the song has increased in volume. It's loud enough now that I can very clearly make out the lyrics. I'm completely unable to escape Tiny Tim's voice. It's followed me everywhere I've gone. Subject 3 is here. It's coming for me, and I know my time left in this world is extremely limited now. I guess you could say that I just wanted to tell the tale of the Harbinger experiment before it was lost forever. I hope that you'll take some lesson from what I've recounted to you, but I think we both know you won't. Let's be honest. You're not going to believe a word of what I've just told you, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe me if I were you. To you, this is probably nothing more than something to get your cheap thrills from. You were probably just surfing the internet, clicked a link, and found yourself here, wherever here may be, listening to this story. And to be honest, I don't care if you believe me or not. Even if you do, it probably won't stop you from trying to uncover the truth of a darkness few of us have ever seen. It certainly never stopped Zimmerman. If you want a lesson, look at what happened to him when he went seeking the truth. I pray that none of you will ever discover this. I pray none of you ever have to see the evil I've seen. I hope you all get to live on, ignorant of what lies beyond the veil of what we can understand. It's here now. I can feel its black eyes burning into me, just as I could all those years ago. I'm as much to blame for this as Zimmerman is for the monstrosity that's now free to roam the world, even if I wasn't the one to create it. I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
I'm right here to stay where I won't stray. I'll be right in my prime. Living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight, having a wonderful